On an ordinary morning in approximately the year 350 after Christ, in the highland city the Greeks called Aksumis and the locals called Aksum, a stonemason stood at the base of a granite obelisk that was about to be raised, and he tilted his head back to look at the sky. The stone in front of him weighed 520 tons. It had been quarried from a mountain 4 kilometers away, dragged on log rollers across a dry plain, and now stood balanced at the lip of the pit where it was supposed to be raised upright by a system of ropes and counterweights and several hundred men working in coordination. This single stone, this one stone, would, when raised, be the largest single piece of rock ever moved and erected by human beings in the history of the world. It would remain the largest piece of rock ever moved and erected by human beings for the next 1,600 years. No civilization, not Rome, not Egypt, not the Khmer, not the Inca, not the modern industrial states with their cranes and steel cables, would ever, in the long span between then and our own century, move a single piece of stone as large as the one that was about to be raised that morning in Aksum. And then, in the middle of the raising, something went wrong. Stone fell. It broke into 3 pieces as it landed, and it has lain in 3 pieces ever since. Walk up to it today. You can stand in the shadow of the largest fragment. You can place your hand on the carved false door at its base, and you can feel in the cool granite the moment the empire that was about to raise it ran out of certainty. Tonight, we are going to walk through that empire. We are going to walk through the empire that the ancient world counted on equal footing with Rome and Persia and China. The empire that minted its own gold coins for 400 years. The empire that became Christian before Rome did. The empire whose monks claim to this day to be the keepers of the lost Ark of the Covenant. The empire that no Western child has ever been asked to memorize in history class. The empire that fell like the great stela in 3 pieces and was then quietly forgotten. We are going to walk through Aksum. Think about what that means for a moment. Every empire whose name you know, Rome, Greece, Egypt, Persia, the various dynasties of China, has been talked about, written about, taught, and retaught, until the very sound of its name carries weight in your mind before you have learned a single fact about it. You know Rome before you know anything about Rome. You can picture a column, a toga, a marble emperor, the silhouette of a Colosseum, and you know in your bones what civilization made these things, because that civilization has been described to you in fragments 10,000 times across your life. Aksum has not been described. And yet, in the 3rd century after Christ, when the Persian prophet Mani sat down to list the 4 greatest kingdoms of the known world, the 4 powers whose names a literate person was expected to recognize, he wrote in this order: Rome, Persia, Aksum, China. And he was not joking. He was not exaggerating. Aksum was one of the 4 powers of the ancient world. Its merchants traded directly with the ports of India and Sri Lanka. Its kings minted coins in gold and silver and bronze in 3 different scripts that were honored from the bazaars of Constantinople to the docks of Muziris. Its inscriptions were carved in Greek and Sabaean and Ge'ez side by side because the empire genuinely required 3 languages to do its business. Yet, 1,500 years later, Mani's list is missing one of its names from the modern world's memory. Tonight we are going to put it back, because here's what we now know. The empire that Mani placed beside Rome ruled at its height the entire Horn of Africa, parts of southern Arabia, Sudan, and the gateway between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. It minted approximately 1,500 different types of coins across 400 years. Built obelisks larger than any civilization has ever raised. It adopted Christianity formally in the year 330 after Christ, 50 years before the Roman Empire made the same decision. And it left behind in the highlands of Tigray, in the rock churches of Lalibela, in the still-spoken language of Ge'ez, in the still-functioning rituals of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, a continuous thread of cultural memory that has now been unbroken for more than 2,000 years. The empire is not technically gone. Stopped being noticed. Tonight, we are going to start noticing again, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to follow this channel, but only if these long, quiet histories help you towards sleep. And if you'd like, drop a comment with where in the world you are listening from tonight. I read everyone. Now dim the lights if you haven't already. Pull a blanket up around your shoulders. Take a deep breath. Let the modern world with its small and urgent things fade gently away. Tonight we travel to the highlands of the Horn of Africa. To a city built of granite and ivory, of incense and gold, of stone obelisks taller than any tower in Europe. To a kingdom that called itself Aksum, and that the Romans called by its Greek name, Aksum, and that the wider ancient world simply called one of the four great kingdoms. Settle in. We are going to begin at the beginning. Now that we have set the stage, it is time to walk back very slowly to the moment before there was an empire at all. Approximately 1,000 years before the great stela fell, in the 8th century before Christ, on the other side of the Red Sea from where Aksum would eventually stand, there was a kingdom in what is now Yemen. It was called Saba, the same name that in the Hebrew Bible would become Sheba. The kingdom of Saba was rich in incense and gold, and the particular tree resins that the ancient world used to anoint its dead and to scent its temples. Saban traders sailed the Red Sea, founded outposts on the African coast, and over centuries slowly, the Sabaean culture pushed across the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, the Gate of Tears, and took root in the highlands on the African side. What grew in those highlands in the long, quiet centuries before the empire of Aksum was born was a culture that was African by geography, Sabaean by language and writing, and over time something entirely new. You can read the inscriptions they left. In a place called Yeha, north of where the city of Aksum would one day stand, a stone temple still rises from the dry plain. It was built in the 7th or 8th century before Christ, and it was dedicated to the moon god Al-Makka, the chief deity of the Sabaean pantheon. The temple walls bear inscriptions in some script, the same script used in Yemen. The architecture is South Arabian. Pottery is South Arabian. The metalwork is South. And yet, around the temple and across the highland plain, the African substrate begins slowly to assert itself. The local Cushitic peoples, the ancestors of the modern Tigrinya, Tigray, and Amhara speakers, were not displaced by the Sabaean immigrants. They mixed with them, married into the new culture. They borrowed the writing system but adapted it to their own languages. They worshipped Al-Makka for a while, but their older gods, the gods of the rains and the highland rivers, did not disappear. They simply walked into the new pantheon and stood beside the moon god. This is how Aksum was born, slowly, and by the 2nd century before Christ, the temple at Yeha was no longer the center of anything in particular. The political weight had shifted south to the plateau around a small market town that was beginning to be called Aksum. We do not know exactly why Aksum and not some other town became the center. Geography helped. Aksum sits on a small ridge between two streams at the meeting point of 3 roads, one running north toward the Red Sea coast and the port of Endubis, one running west toward the Nile and the kingdoms of Cush and Meroe, and one running south into the rich agricultural lands of the highland interior. It is, in other words, a city you would naturally pass through if you were moving goods between the Mediterranean world and the Indian Ocean world. It is also, importantly, at an altitude of about 2,000 meters, high enough to be cool, dry, and almost mosquito-free, which made it survivable in a way the lower coastal cities were not. In the 1st century after Christ, Aksum was no longer just a market town. It was a small kingdom. And then, almost without warning, it became a great one. Here is how we know. In the middle of the 1st century after Christ, somewhere along the Red Sea coast, a Greek-speaking merchant sat down with a stylus and a roll of papyrus and wrote a practical handbook for sailors and traders. It was a guide to the ports of the Red Sea, the East African coast, and the western shore of India. It listed every harbor, what could be bought and sold there, what currencies were accepted, what to expect from the local rulers. The book has come down to us through the centuries under the title Periplas Maris Erythraei, The Voyage Around the Erythraean Sea. And on one of its pages, the anonymous Greek merchant wrote a description of a particular port on the African coast. He called it Endubis. He said it was the principal trading station of the Ethiopian interior. He noted that ivory was its main export, but that gold dust, rhinoceros horn, tortoiseshell, frankincense, and slaves also moved through it. He named the king who controlled the port. He called him Zascale. He noted, almost in passing, that Zascale spoke Greek. A king of the African interior, in the 1st century after Christ, fluent in the international trading language of the Eastern Mediterranean. A king who minted no coins of his own yet, that would come later, but who understood the value of being a participant in the long-distance commerce that ran from Rome to India. The empire was already gathering itself. By the 2nd century, the kings of Aksum had moved beyond Greek fluency and into something more permanent. They began to mint their own. The earliest Axumite coins we have are tiny gold and silver discs, struck with the image of the king's head in profile, surrounded by stalks of grain or the symbols of the South Arabian moon and sun. The oldest of these coins are inscribed in Greek. Think about what that means. A kingdom in the highlands of East Africa, in the 2nd century after Christ, was issuing its own gold currency and choosing to inscribe that currency in the international language of trade, so that a merchant in Alexandria or Antioch or Berenike would, on receiving an Aksumite coin, be able to read the king's name. This is a kingdom that knew exactly what kind of world it was operating in. It was not isolated. Was not provincial. It was a global player, and it was deliberately dressing for the part. In the 3rd century, the kings of Aksum began to add a second inscription to their coins. They kept the Greek on one side. On the other side, they began to write in Ge'ez, the local language, in a script that was rapidly evolving from its Sabaean ancestor into something distinct, something Axumite. It was a quiet but profound declaration. We are an empire, the coins were saying. We use your language because we trade with you. But we have a language of our own, and we are not, in any sense, your subject. The Axumites were the only African civilization south of Egypt to mint their own coins in the ancient world. The only one. Across the whole long span of African history, from the Carthaginian shoreline of the Mediterranean to the gold kingdoms of West Africa, the only empire south of the Sahara to issue a sustained, internationally respected coinage of its own was Aksum. It is one of those facts that once you hear it, you cannot quite unhear. By the 3rd century, Aksum was already known across the wider world. And historian Cassius Dio mentions it. The Persian prophet Mani names it as one of the 4 great kingdoms. The trading manuals of the Indian Ocean list its port. Its coins have been found in archaeological digs as far away as southern India and the eastern coast of Britain. And we have not yet in this story arrived at the moment Aksum became Christian. We have not yet arrived at the conquest of Meroe. We have not yet arrived at the great stela. We have not yet arrived at the lost ark or the Queen of Sheba or the Italian theft of a national monument or the slow, almost imperceptible vanishing. We have only arrived at the beginning. Already the world was paying attention. And that is where we will leave chapter 1. Now that we have walked through the long centuries of becoming, it is time to walk into the moment of being. In approximately the year 270 after Christ, a king of Aksum named Endubis sat in his palace at the center of his highland city, and he made a decision that would alter the economic shape of the ancient world for the next 400 years. He decided to mint for the first time an Axumite gold coin. We need to pause here and consider what it meant in the 3rd century after Christ to mint a gold coin. In the Roman world, gold coinage was the prerogative of the emperor. Persia of the Shah. China, the use of gold was largely symbolic. Chinese trade ran on bronze and silver, not gold. To mint gold in the 3rd century after Christ was to declare oneself a peer of Rome, a peer of Persia, a peer of the small handful of states whose currency was accepted on faith from one end of the known world to the other. It was, in other words, a declaration of empire. And the kings of Aksum, when they made this declaration, did so with a quiet thoroughness that suggests they had been thinking about it for a long time. The earliest Axumite gold coins, the coins of Endubis and his successors, were small, approximately the weight of a Roman aureus, with a slightly different gold purity. They bore the king's portrait on the obverse, his name in Greek, and on the reverse a long Greek inscription naming his titles: King of the Aksumites, King of the Habashat, King of the Sabaeans, King of the Salans, King of the Siamo, King of the Beja, the man of Halan, son of the invincible god Mahram. Mahram was the war god of the Aksumites, descended in part from the Sabaean tradition, but adapted into a uniquely Aksumite figure. The kings of Aksum, in their pre-Christian coinage, all called themselves son of Mahram, son of the war god, the invincible. Kings were not divine themselves, but they were the war god's children, and they ruled by his strength. Across the next few decades, the coin types proliferated. The kings of Aksum issued coins in gold, silver, and bronze in dozens of variations, with subtle changes of design and inscription that allow modern numismatists to trace the succession of kings with surprising accuracy. We know the names of more than 30 Aksumite kings from their coinage alone. We have, in some cases, almost no other historical record of them, no chronicle, no inscription, no monument. Only their faces struck in gold, looking out at us from across 1,700 years. Aphila, Sheba, Ezana, Zabaz, Yeha, Hedayas, Israel, Gersum, Arma. Each of these names was once a king. Each ruled briefly an empire that controlled the Red Sea, the Horn of Africa, and at moments parts of southern Arabia. Each is now almost entirely forgotten, except in the small, careful catalogs of coin collectors and academic specialists in late antique East African history. But one of these names, one of the names struck in gold in the 4th century after Christ, would not be forgotten. His name was Ezana. He ascended the throne of Aksum at some point in the late 320s or early 330s after Christ. The precise date is debated. He was by all accounts a young man when he came to power. He inherited an empire that had been at war with the kingdom of Kush, the Nubian successor to ancient Egypt, centered at the city of Meroe on the Upper Nile, for at least a generation. Ezana ended that war. In approximately the year 350 after Christ, he led an Aksumite army across the highlands, down into the Nile Valley, and into the heart of the Kushite kingdom. The exact details of the campaign survive in a remarkable document, an inscription that Ezana himself ordered carved on a stone slab in 3 languages after his victory. The inscription is sometimes called the Monumentum Adulitanum, although the original of that is a different inscription. The more famous text we are referring to is the Ezana stone, found near the city of Aksum, which describes his conquest of the Beja peoples and his campaign into Morocco. The inscription is one of the most extraordinary documents to survive from the ancient world. Ezana writes in Greek and Sabaean and Ge'ez, all on the same stone, all describing the same events. He recounts his victory, lists the peoples he conquered, describes the booty he took, cattle, sheep, prisoners, gold, records the territory he annexed, the cities he sacked, the populations he resettled. And at the end of the inscription, he gives thanks to God. God. Time of his Mero campaign, Ezana had converted to Christianity. The story of how this happened is preserved with some embellishment in the histories of the early Christian church. The most detailed account comes from a Christian historian named Rufinus, writing in the late 4th century, who claims to have heard the story directly from one of the principal figures involved. The story goes like this. Approximately 20 or 30 years before Ezana's reign, somewhere along the Red Sea coast, a Greek philosopher from Tyre named Meropius set sail with 2 young Christian boys he was raising, his nephew or some kind of ward named Frumentius, and another boy named Adesius. The 3 of them were traveling on a merchant ship, perhaps as part of a trading expedition. On their return voyage, they put in at a small port on the African coast for water. While they were ashore, a dispute broke out between the local people and the Roman Empire, and the local people, in retribution, attacked the ship and killed everyone on board. One except the 2 boys. Frumentius and Adesius were taken alive, brought to the royal court at Aksum, and presented to the king as captives. The king at the time, probably Usanus, Ezana's father, was apparently charmed by the 2 young Greek-speaking Christians. Kept them at court. Made them in time his secretary. Frumentius rose to become the king's treasurer. Adesius became the royal cupbearer. When the king died, the queen mother held the regency for the young prince, Ezana. She asked the 2 Greek boys, now grown men, to remain at court and help her run the kingdom until her son was old enough to take the throne. They agreed. During those years, they began very quietly to teach Christianity to Ezana. When Ezana came of age and assumed full kingship, Adesius asked permission to return home. He was granted it. He sailed back to Tyre and eventually became a priest there, where the historian Rufinus met him and heard this story. But Frumentius did not return. Frumentius traveled instead to Alexandria in Egypt, the great center of Eastern Christianity. He sought an audience with the patriarch, Athanasius, one of the most consequential figures in the history of early Christianity, the man who shaped the doctrine of the Trinity at the Council of Nicaea. Frumentius told Athanasius about the kingdom in the highlands, about the young king who was open to the faith, about the need for a bishop and priests and the building of churches. Athanasius, according to Rufinus, looked at Frumentius and said, "We have decided. And for this task is you." He consecrated Frumentius as the first bishop of Aksum on the spot and sent him back to the highlands. Frumentius returned, baptized Ezana, baptized the royal court, and began the construction of the first churches. The kingdom of Aksum, by the year 340, was officially Christian. This was a remarkable thing. Constantine the Great had declared Christianity a tolerated religion in the Roman Empire in 313. He had himself converted privately, but Roman state Christianity would not be formally established until Theodosius I in 380. Aksum beat Rome. Aksum in 330 became one of the first Christian states in the world. Only Armenia, which had converted under King Tiridates III around 301, was earlier. For the rest of the ancient world, Aksum's conversion was startling. A great empire deep in the African continent had become Christian and had done so independently by its own choice through a Greek-speaking refugee who had risen from captive to royal treasurer to bishop. By the year 350, when Ezana led his army into Meroe, he led it as a Christian king. The Ezana stone, the one with the inscription in 3 languages, is one of the earliest royal Christian inscriptions on earth. It opens not with the standard pre-Christian formula by the power of Marum, the invincible war god, son of Marum, but with a new formula by the power of the Lord of Heaven, who has given me victory. The transition is visible in the stone itself. Earlier inscriptions of Ezana invoke Marum. Later ones invoke the Christian God. We can watch in real time across the granite a king changing his religion. The empire entered its golden age. For the next 200 years, Aksum would be one of the great Christian states of the world, equal in stature if not in size, with the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Empire of Persia. Coinage spread through the Indian Ocean. Its merchants traded with the Roman world, with India, with Sri Lanka, with the courts of southern Arabia. Its monks built churches and monasteries in the highland valleys. And in the center of the city of Aksum, a series of kings, beginning with Ezana himself and perhaps even earlier, began to raise the stones. Stelae. The great granite obelisks for which Aksum is to this day most famous. That is the story we will tell in Chapter 3. Now that we have followed Aksum through its rise, through Endubis, through the long Greek-speaking decades, through Frumentius and Ezana and the conversion to Christianity, it is time to walk through one of the most extraordinary and most overlooked achievements of the ancient world. Stelae of Aksum. If you arrive in Aksum today, in the small modern town that sits on the ruins of the ancient city, the first thing you will see is the northern stelae field. It is essentially a meadow. A wide sloping meadow fringed with eucalyptus trees with paths wandering between low stone walls and ancient tombs. Rising from this meadow like masts from a green sea are the granite obelisks. There are several hundred stelae at Aksum, ranging from small rough-cut markers perhaps a meter high to colossal carved monoliths weighing hundreds of tons. They were raised across approximately 300 years, from the 3rd to the 6th centuries after Christ. The earliest were simple. Later ones were extraordinary works of art. The tallest of them, the one that fell, was a single piece of granite 33 meters in height, weighing approximately 520 tons. For comparison, the tallest Egyptian obelisk that still stands, the Lateran obelisk in Rome, originally erected at the Temple of Karnak, is 32 meters tall and weighs 330 tons. The Axumite Great Stela was both taller and significantly heavier. It was the largest single piece of stone ever raised by human beings. And in approximately the 4th century after Christ, it fell. We do not know exactly. The standard interpretation accepted by most archaeologists who have studied the site is that the stela fell during or shortly after its erection. The hole in the ground beneath it, where the base was supposed to seed into the bedrock, shows signs of failure. The stela, when it fell, broke into 3 large pieces and several smaller ones, in a pattern consistent with falling from a vertical position back down into the pit from which it had just been raised. It is, in other words, one of the largest failed engineering projects in human history. But to call it a failure is to miss what it tells us about the empire. The fact that the Axumites attempted to raise such a stone, that they organized the labor to quarry it, transport it 4 kilometers across a dry plain, carp its surface, and erect it, tells us something very specific about the kingdom in the 4th century. Was at that moment confident. The stelae were not just funerary markers, although they probably did mark royal graves. They were assertions. They were carved into the shape of multi-story buildings, with false doors at the base, false windows running up the sides, and crowns at the top. They are in stone representations of palaces. They are claims of dynasty, claims of permanence, claims that the king who lies beneath this stone was the head of a household whose tower reaches almost to heaven. The next tallest stela, which still stands today, is the so-called King Ezana stela, about 24 meters high. It is the largest standing obelisk anywhere in the world. It has stood unbroken for 1,600 years. The carving on its surface is delicate, precise, and clearly architectural. You can count its imaginary floors, see its false windows, almost imagine pushing open its false door at the base. The 3rd stela, called the Stela of Aksum, or the Rome stela, is 24 meters tall and weighs 160 tons. It was carved in the 4th century, fell at some point in the early modern period, and lay in pieces until, and this is one of the strangest twists in the long story of Aksum, Benito Mussolini, in 1937, ordered it transported to Rome as a war trophy following the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. Stood in Rome near the Circus Maximus for nearly 70 years. It was finally returned to Ethiopia in 2005 after decades of a diplomatic effort by successive Ethiopian governments. It was re-erected at Aksum in 2008. The day it was re-erected, the entire town held vigil. Tens of thousands of people came. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church held a service. Bells rang. The stela stood again in the soil from which it had been carved 1,600 years earlier. That moment in 2008 is the closest the modern world has come to acknowledging what Aksum was. Beneath the stelae, the archaeologists found tomb of the brick arch, the mausoleum, tomb of the false door. Each was elaborate, carefully constructed, with chambers and antechambers and corridors descending into the bedrock. Each contained, when excavated, fragments of grave goods, ivory carvings, bronze fittings, pottery, occasionally glass vessels imported from the eastern Mediterranean. Tombs were robbed, most of them anciently. Robbing was thorough. We have, from the great royal tombs of Aksum, almost no inscribed sarcophagi, no royal jewelry, no gold burial goods of the kind that came from Egyptian and Persian and Roman royal grave. What we have are the tombs themselves, their architecture, their care, the clear, unmistakable evidence that a wealthy, sophisticated civilization buried its kings here in elaborate underground vaults and marked the surface above them with the largest worked stones the world has ever seen. And then after the 6th century, the stelae stopped being raised. No new royal obelisks were erected after the reign of King Caleb in the early 6th century. The Axumite kings continued to bury their dead in elaborate tombs, but the monumental stone tradition slowly faded. You can guess why. The labor required to raise a great stela was enormous. The skill required to carve its surface was specialized. The transport infrastructure, the roads, the rollers, the teams of men and oxen required a state that could mobilize resources on a continental scale. When the stelae stopped, something in the empire had begun to thin out. The stones that had been raised did not fall. Stand most of them to this day. Some have stood continuously for more than 1,600 years through earthquakes, through wars, through invasions, through the long centuries when the empire that built them was forgotten by everyone except the people living among the stone. You go to Aksum today, you can stand in the shadow of the King Ezana stela. You can look up at 24 meters of carved granite, a stone palace rising from the ground, carved with windows and doors and a crown, and you can place your hand on the base, and you can feel in the cool stone the same surface a 4th century carver smoothed with his own hands. Stones are still here. Empire is in some sense not just very, very quiet. And that is where we will leave chapter 3. Now that we have walked through the stones, it is time to walk through the story the people of Aksum tell about themselves. Aksum has a foundation myth. Empire has one. Rome had Romulus and Remus suckled by a wolf. The Persians had Cyrus hidden as an infant from the prophecy of his birth. The Chinese had the Yellow Emperor, the founder of civilization. The empires that endure long enough always, in time, write themselves a story of how they began, and the story is almost never the literal truth, and the story is almost always, in some other sense, deeply revealing. The foundation myth of Aksum is one of the most extraordinary in the ancient world. It is preserved in its fullest form in a 14th century Ge'ez text called the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of the Kings. The Kebra Nagast was compiled, edited, and arguably composed in its final form by Ethiopian Orthodox monks in the late medieval period. But the stories it contains are much older. Fragments of them appear in earlier sources. They were almost certainly being told in some form in the highlands of Aksum centuries before they were ever written down. What the Kebra Nagast says: in the 10th century before Christ, in the kingdom of Israel, a king named Solomon ruled with such wisdom that his fame spread to the furthest corners of the known world. Far to the south, in a kingdom called Saba, or in the Hebrew telling, Sheba, a queen heard of Solomon's wisdom and decided to travel to Jerusalem to test it for herself. This queen in the Hebrew Bible is She is simply the queen of Sheba. She comes to Solomon, asks him hard questions, marvels at his wisdom and the splendor of his court, gives him gifts of gold and spices, and returns home. Kebra Nagast, the queen, has a name. It's called Makeda. And her journey to Jerusalem does not end with her marveling and returning home. It ends with something else. Solomon, the story goes, was a man of many appetites. Upon Makeda and wanted her. She refused him. Solomon promised her she could leave whenever she liked, but with one condition: she must take anything from his household without his permission. That night, after a feast salted heavily with spiced food, Makeda woke in the night with a desperate thirst. Rose, found a cup of water, and drank. Solomon, who had been waiting for exactly this moment, appeared and reminded her of her promise. By drinking his water without permission, she had taken something from his household. Had her by her own oath. Bore him a son. She returned to Saba, or to Aksum. The Kebra Nagast has the queen ruling both, and there in due course she gave birth to a boy. Named him Menelik. When Menelik grew to manhood, his mother told him who his father was. Menelik traveled to Jerusalem to meet Solomon. Solomon recognized his son, embraced him, kept him at court for several years, and taught him the ways of the Israelite kingdom. When Menelik was ready to return home, Solomon prepared him a great escort, the firstborn sons of the noble families of Israel, sent with him to serve as the foundation of a new royal court in Aksum. Among the young men in this escort was the son of the high priest Azariah. The night before the escort was to depart, Azariah, according to the Keber Nagast, instructed by an angel of God, stole into the Holy of Holies of the Temple of Solomon. Removed the Ark of the Covenant. He replaced it with an exact duplicate, carved in haste so that the substitution would not be noticed for years. He carried the original Ark out of the temple, joined the escort, and traveled south with Menelik to Aksum. When Solomon discovered the theft, days later he wept. But the ark was beyond his reach, and the prophets told him that this was the will of God, that the ark had transferred its blessing, by divine decree, from Israel to a new chosen people, the people of the kingdom of Aksum. The ark, the Keber Nagast says, has lived in Aksum ever since. It is housed today in a small chapel beside the church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, in the center of the modern city. Only one man is permitted to see it, a single monk, the guardian of the ark, who is selected by lottery from among the Ethiopian Orthodox priesthood, and who, once selected, spends the rest of his life inside the chapel, never leaving its precincts until the day of his death, at which point a new guardian is selected. Successive guardians have been asked by journalists, by archaeologists, by visiting heads of state to describe what is inside the chapel. Have uniformly refused. The ark for outside eyes. It is the holiest object in the world, and it is the inheritance of a single people, and to expose it to the curiosity of strangers would be to break a covenant older than the city it sits in. Whatever is inside that chapel, and there is almost certainly something, has been guarded continuously for at least 1600 years. The story of Menelik and the ark is, in literal historical terms, almost certainly a legend. Solomon was probably real. The Queen of Sheba was probably real. In some form, the references in the Hebrew Bible suggest a memory of trade contacts with the kingdom of Saba, which was certainly real. But the chain of inference from there to a single boy carrying the original ark across the Red Sea is not the kind of inference that historians of the ancient world accept as confirmed. What is real, however, is the function of the story. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has, for at least 1500 years, organized its theology around the idea that the Ethiopian people are a chosen people. God transferred his covenant from Israel to Ethiopia. That the kings of the Solomonic dynasty, the dynasty that ruled Ethiopia, with brief interruptions from approximately the 13th century right up until Haile Selassie's deposition in 1974, were descendants of Solomon and Makeda, and therefore descendants of the line of David. This claim was not just spiritual, it was political. Legitimized the Ethiopian monarchy for 7 centuries. It shaped the country's diplomatic relations with the wider Christian world. It influenced the Ethiopian constitution, which named the emperor as elect of God, conquering lion of the tribe of Judah. Every Ethiopian Orthodox church to this day contains a tabot, a replica of the Ark of the Covenant. The tabot is the symbolic heart of every Ethiopian church. Mass is celebrated around, paraded through the streets on holy days. It is the link in Ethiopian theology between the local congregation and the historical reality of God's covenant. In every Ethiopian church there is an ark. In the chapel beside the church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum, the Ethiopians believe there is the ark. It is one of the strangest, most enduring, most quietly serious claims in the history of any religion. And it sits to this day in a small chapel in a small town in the highlands of Tigray behind a single closed door, watched by a single monk who has not left the courtyard since the day he was chosen. Empire is gone. The Ethiopians say is still here. The story Aksum tells about itself. And that is where we will leave chapter 4. Now that we have walked through the gold, the stelae, the saints, and the sacred ark, it is time to walk through the long, quiet centuries during which Aksum stopped being an empire. Because Aksum did not fall. That is one of the most important things to understand about its end. There was no single moment of catastrophe. No sack by barbarians, no decisive battle, no plague that emptied the city in a single season. The empire of Aksum did not fall the way Rome fell, or the way the Khmer fell, or the way the Maya fell. It faded. And the fading took, by most reasonable estimates, between 200 and 400 years. To understand what happened, we have to begin in the 6th century after Christ, at what was in many ways the high watermark of Aksumite power. The king at that time was named Caleb. He ruled from approximately 520 to 540 after Christ. He was a contemporary of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, and the two corresponded. We have a Byzantine source describing the embassies that traveled between them. Caleb is famous for one specific. In approximately 525, news reached him that a Jewish king of Himyar in modern Yemen named Yusuf Asar Yathar, usually called Du Nuwas in the Arabic sources, had massacred the Christian community at the city of Najran. The massacre was particularly brutal. Thousands of Christians were burned alive or thrown into mass graves. The news spread rapidly through the Christian world. Caleb assembled an army, sailed across the Red Sea, defeated Du Nuwas, and installed a Christian client king in Himyar. It was a major military expedition conducted across a body of water by a kingdom in the African highlands against a kingdom in southern Arabia. It was also the last time Aksum projected military power on that kind of scale. After Caleb, the empire begins to contract. Here is what was happening in the broader world. In 541, the plague of Justinian arrived in the Mediterranean. It was, almost certainly, the first historically recorded outbreak of Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that would, 800 years later, produce the Black Death. The plague of Justinian was apocalyptic. Killed, by some estimates, between 30 and 50% of the population of the Byzantine Empire. Modern genetic studies have traced the strain of plague that caused it back ultimately to East Africa. Aksum, which sat at the crossroads of the trade routes between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, was almost certainly devastated by the same plague. But unlike the Mediterranean, where the Roman bureaucracy continued to keep records, in Aksum we have almost no documentary trace of the plague years. We have instead a much subtler signal. The coinage of Aksum begins to thin out. The quality of the gold declines. The number of new dies, the iron stamps used to strike coins, dropped. The reigns of the kings become shorter, the names less attested, the inscriptions less elaborate. A century after Caleb, by approximately 640 after Christ, the kingdom is still functioning, but it is functioning at a much smaller scale. Meanwhile, in the Hijaz, several hundred kilometers north and east of Aksum, something else was happening. Prophet Muhammad was preaching in Mecca. By 622, he had emigrated to Medina. By 632, the year of his death, the Arabian Peninsula was largely unified under the new Islamic faith. By 640, Muslim armies had conquered Persia, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. By 670, the entire southern Mediterranean shoreline was Muslim. For Aksum, which had built its economy on Red Sea trade, this was a transformation. It's worth pausing to note a particular detail. Prophet Muhammad himself had a connection to Aksum. In the very early days of his preaching, Before his emigration to Medina, the small Muslim community in Mecca was being persecuted by the Quraysh. Muhammad advised some of his followers to flee. They asked where they should go. He told them to cross the Red Sea to the kingdom of Aksum, where, he said, there ruled a Christian king who was a just man. King at the time was Arma, sometimes called the Najashi, the Negus in Gayas, the title of the Ethiopian king. He received the Muslim refugees, listened to their description of the new faith, and granted them protection. Lived in Aksum peacefully for several years. When the Quraysh sent emissaries to demand the refugees' extradition, Arma refused. This is a story that Muslims to this day remember. There is a tradition in Islamic jurisprudence that the Christian Ethiopians, because of Arma's protection of the early Muslim community, are to be treated with particular respect, not as enemies of Islam, but as a people who showed kindness when kindness mattered most. It is one of the most extraordinary diplomatic stories in the history of the ancient world. Persecuted prophet in Mecca recommending refuge in a Christian African kingdom. A Christian African king protecting Muslim refugees from their own people. A long, quiet thread of mutual respect woven into the texts of both traditions. But the wider political effect of the rise of Islam for Aksum was disastrous. The Red Sea trade, on which the empire had depended for 500 years, was now controlled in stages by Muslim navies and Muslim merchants. The ports of southern Arabia, which Aksum had once held client kingships over, were now in the hands of the Umayyad and later the Abbasid caliphates. The port of Endubis itself, the gateway to the Axumite interior, declined. By the 8th century, it was largely abandoned. The empire was being cut off from its source of wealth. At the same time, in the highlands themselves, the climate was changing. We have now fairly good paleoclimate data for the Horn of Africa across this period. Data is consistent. The 7th and 8th centuries see a long-term drying trend. Rains fail more often. Nile floods less reliably. The agricultural base of the empire, the highland farms that fed Aksum's population, comes under pressure. There is also archaeological evidence of soil erosion in the highlands. The hillsides around Aksum, after centuries of intensive farming, were losing their topsoil. Yields declined. Population slowly declined with. By the 9th century, Aksum was no longer the capital of an empire. It was a regional center, important for religious reasons, but no longer the political heart of anything. The kings, and there were still kings, descended in some sense from the Axumite line, had moved their courts south, away from the deteriorating north. Around 900 after Christ, a queen named Gudit, sometimes called Yodit, led a campaign across the highlands that, depending on which source you read, either marked the end of the Solomonic dynasty's first phase or was a much smaller event subsequently exaggerated. Historical Gudit is hard to pin down. Legend is enormous. She is supposed to have burned churches, destroyed monuments, killed priests. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church remembers her as a kind of apocalyptic figure. What is certain is that by the time the dust settled in the early 10th century, the political center of Ethiopia had moved south to a new dynasty, the Zagwe, who would build in the rock-cut churches of Lalibela some of the most remarkable Christian monuments in the world. But the Zagwe were not Aksum. They came from a different ethnic and linguistic background, the Aga peoples, who had been within the Aksumite cultural sphere but who had their own identity. The old empire by the year 1000 was effectively gone. The city of Aksum, however, was not gone. It remained the religious capital of Ethiopia. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion still stood. The Chapel of the Ark still stood. The stelae still stood, the ones that had not fallen. The monks of the surrounding monasteries continued their offices in Giez, in the same liturgical tradition that Frumentius had brought from Alexandria. The empire had faded. Culture had not. The thread continued, very quietly through the centuries, in the highland villages and the rock churches, in the slow, patient transcription of manuscripts in monastic scriptoria. The wider world almost completely forgot. That is where we will leave chapter 5. Now that we have walked through the fading, it is time to walk through the long, strange, twisted process by which the rest of the world slowly, partially, painfully began to remember. After the year 1000, the kingdom of Aksum as a political entity no longer existed. But the cultural and religious infrastructure it had built was still there in the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, in the Giez language, in the highland monasteries, in the continuing tradition of the Solomonic dynasty which, from approximately 1270 onwards, would rule Ethiopia, on and off, until 1974. But from outside Ethiopia, almost no one knew any of this. The Greek and Roman geographies that had mentioned Aksum were buried in archives. The Arabic geographies that mentioned the Habashat, the term for the Ethiopian peoples, which is the root of the word Abyssinia, were available in Islamic scholarly circles, but largely unknown in Christian Europe. For 1,000 years, Europe operated under an idea of the African interior that was essentially a blank. The legend of Prester John, the imagined Christian king somewhere far to the east or south of the known Christian world, circulated through medieval Europe and pointed in some vague way toward Ethiopia. Prester John was a fantasy, not a knowledge of Aksum. It was the Portuguese who, in the early 16th century, made the first sustained European contact with the Ethiopian highlands since late antiquity. In 1520, a Portuguese embassy arrived at the court of the Emperor Lebna-Dengel, a Solomonic king, who was struggling to defend his realm against Adal, a Muslim sultanate to the east. The Portuguese had been looking for Prester John. What they found was a Christian kingdom deeply impressive in its religious architecture and its liturgical depth, but in the middle of a war that was going badly. The Portuguese sent military aid. In 1543, a Portuguese force led by Cristóvão da Gama, the son of the famous navigator Vasco da Gama, fought alongside the Ethiopian army at the Battle of Wainadaga, defeating Adal and saving the kingdom. The Portuguese ambassador Francisco Alvarez wrote a detailed account of his time in Ethiopia. He described the rock churches of Lalibela. He described the city of Aksum, the stelae, the Church of Mary of Zion. He described the liturgy, the priests, the manuscript. His account was published in 1540 as the true information of the lands of Prester John. For European audiences, a revelation. Here was a Christian kingdom in Africa, with its own theology, its own liturgical language, its own continuous tradition stretching back to the time of Constantine. Here was a kingdom that claimed descent from Solomon. Here was a kingdom that, in some texts, claimed possession of the Ark of the Covenant. For European scholars in the 16th and 17th centuries, this was a puzzle. Christian Ethiopia did not fit easily into the standard European narrative of Christian history. It was not Catholic. It was not Protestant. It was not Greek Orthodox. It was something else, a Christianity that had developed in parallel, in isolation, in the highlands of an African empire that European maps had not until that point properly registered. For the next 300 years, scholarly knowledge of Ethiopia, and through Ethiopia of Aksum, slowly grew. Various Catholic missionary efforts came and went. The Jesuits, briefly in the 17th century, persuaded an Ethiopian emperor to convert to Catholicism, which provoked an enormous backlash from the Tewahedo Church, and the emperor was forced to abdicate. Catholic mission collapsed. Through the 18th century, European travelers continued to visit. The Scottish explorer James Bruce, who spent 5 years in Ethiopia in the 1760s and 70s, returned to Europe with detailed accounts of the country, of its monarchy, of its monastic traditions, and crucially, of the Kebra Nagast, the foundational text of the Solomonic line. Bruce's account, published in 1790, was the first significant European introduction to the texts and traditions of Axumite Christianity. Proper archaeological investigation of Aksum itself did not begin until the early 20th century. In 1906, a German expedition, the Deutsche Aksum Expedition, arrived in the city. Over the course of several years, the German archaeologists carefully mapped the stela field, documented the inscriptions of King Ezana, photographed the architecture, and produced the first comprehensive scholarly account of the ancient city. Their multi-volume publication, which appeared in 1913, remains a foundational work in Axumite studies. Then came 1934. Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy, looked at the map of Africa and saw in Ethiopia a piece of unfinished imperial business. Italy had, in 1896, suffered one of the most humiliating colonial defeats in European history at the Battle of Adwa, an Italian army defeated by an Ethiopian army under the Emperor Menelik II. Mussolini intended to... In October of 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia. The invasion was brutal. Italian forces used poison gas in violation of the Geneva Protocol against Ethiopian armies and civilians. By May of 1936, the Italians had captured Addis Ababa. The Emperor Haile Selassie fled into exile, where he would make a famous speech before the League of Nations, warning the world that what was being done to Ethiopia would, if not stopped, eventually be done to all of them. Was, of course, correct. During the Italian occupation, Mussolini ordered the looting of Aksum. The stela that we mentioned at the start of Chapter 3, the stela of Aksum, the 24-meter, 160-ton carved granite obelisk, was dismantled, transported by truck across Ethiopia to the port at Massawa, loaded onto a ship, and brought to Rome. There, it was re-erected near the Circus Maximus in 1937 as a war trophy commemorating the Italian conquest of Ethiopia. It stood there for 68 years. The Italian occupation of Ethiopia ended in 1941 when British and Ethiopian forces drove the Italians out. Haile Selassie returned to his throne. The country regained its independence. The stela remained in Rome. For the next several decades, successive Ethiopian governments asked for its return. The Italians repeatedly promised to return it. The promise was made in 1947 when Ethiopia signed the peace treaty with Italy. It was reaffirmed in 1956, in 1961, and 1997. It was, however, not actually returned until 2005. In April of that year, the stela was carefully dismantled in Rome, transported by air, in 3 flights because no single aircraft could carry the whole stone, back to Ethiopia, and stored at Aksum Airport while a foundation was prepared. In 2008, on the morning of September 4th, the stela was re-erected on its original site at Aksum. The town gathered. Ethiopians from across the country traveled to Aksum to witness it. The patriarch of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church led prayers. Sirens sounded. The stone, almost 1,000 years older than Italy, almost 2,000 years older than the modern Ethiopian state, was raised once more into the highland sky. The story of the stela's theft and return is in some ways the perfect parable for Aksum's long arc. The empire was great. Then it faded. Then it was forgotten. A piece of it was stolen. Then it was, after great effort, returned. The thread continued. The story is not yet finished. 1974, the long line of the Solomonic monarchy ended. Haile Selassie was deposed by a Marxist military junta, the Derg, and died almost certainly by murder the following year. He was the last emperor of Ethiopia. The dynasty that claimed descent from Solomon and Makeda, from the Kibra Nagast, from the line that began with Menelik I, came to its end after 704 years of mostly continuous rule. But the church remained. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, with its tabbas and its Giz liturgy and its Chapel of the Ark, continues today. It claims currently approximately 50 million members, mostly in Ethiopia and Eritrea, with diaspora congregations across the world. The language of Aksum Giz is no longer spoken as a vernacular, but it is, like Latin in the Catholic Church, the liturgical language of Ethiopian Christianity. Ethiopian Orthodox priest learns it. Mass is conducted in it. When you walk into an Ethiopian Orthodox church today, anywhere in the world, in Addis Ababa, or in Washington, D.C., or in London, or in Toronto, you are hearing a language that was last a living vernacular when Aksum was minting gold coins. Empire is gone. The thread is not. Now that we have walked through the 700 years between the fall of Aksum and the slow return of European attention, it is time to walk through one more long, quiet stretch. Because the story does not end with the return of the stela in 2008. There are woven into the fabric of the world half a dozen threads that lead directly and indirectly back to the highlands of Aksum. Most people who pull on these threads do not realize where they end up. But the threads are there, and tonight we will follow a few of them. First thread is the script. The script in which Ethiopian Orthodox priests still write today, the script printed on Ethiopian banknotes, the script taught in every Ethiopian school, is called Giez. We have mentioned it several times. We have not yet said where it comes from. Giez is a descendant of the South Arabian Musnad script, the same script the Sabaeans brought across the Bab el-Mandeb in the 8th century before Christ. It is, in some sense, a sibling of the modern Arabic alphabet. They share a common ancestor in the Abjads of the ancient Near East. Giez did something its siblings did not. In the 4th century after Christ, around the time of King Ezana and the introduction of Christianity, Axumite scribes made a small but extraordinary modification to the Musnad script. Began to mark vowel. The original Musnad script, like Arabic and Hebrew, was a consonant-only system. Vowels had to be supplied by the reader from context. It worked well enough for native speakers, but it required a lot of background knowledge. Axumites changed it. They added small diacritical marks to each consonant, little hooks and circles attached to the base letter that indicated which vowel followed. The result was a script in which every syllable was fully written, in which a reader could pronounce the text without needing to know the meaning in advance. It was essentially the invention of an abugida, a syllabic alphabet, out of an abjad. The Giz of the 4th century after Christ is one of the earliest fully vowelized scripts in the history of writing. This change made Ethiopian Christianity teachable in a way that pre-Christian Aksum had not needed. Liturgical texts could be sung accurately by clergy who did not speak the original languages of the source document. The Bible could be read aloud by junior priests without senior supervision. The entire Tewahedo liturgical tradition, which would persist for the next 1600 years, depended on this small typographical innovation in the 4th century. When you watch an Ethiopian Orthodox priest reading from a manuscript today, in 2026, the script those characters belong to is a continuous and direct descendant of the script the Aksumites modified 1700 years ago for exactly this purpose. This is the first thread. The second thread is the people called the Beta Israel. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, in the region around Gondar, there has lived for at least 1,000 years and possibly much longer a community of Jews. They call themselves the Beta Israel, the House of Israel. The origins of the Beta Israel are debated. The community's own traditions trace their ancestry, like the Kibra Nagas traces the line of Solomon, back to the Israelite escort that accompanied Menelik I when he returned south from Jerusalem in the 10th century before Christ. According to this telling, the Beta Israel are the descendants of the noble youths who traveled with Menelik and Azariah, who carried the ark, who founded the Aksumite kingdom alongside its African substrate. Historical reality is more layered. Modern genetic studies suggest that the Beta Israel are primarily of African origin, with significant cultural and possibly some genetic admixture from much earlier Jewish or proto-Jewish traders and communities, and that the community probably crystallized as a distinct Jewish ethnic group during the centuries when Aksum was still a regional power. What is certain is that for at least 800 years, and possibly 2,500, there has been a community in the Ethiopian highlands that practiced a distinctive form of Judaism. Keeping the Sabbath, observing dietary laws, reading what they called the Orit, which is the Ge'ez translation of the Torah and the early Hebrew Bible. Beta Israel did not have the Talmud. They did not know the rabbinical tradition that developed in the Jewish diaspora in late antiquity. Judaism was older, simpler, more directly biblical. It was the Judaism that existed before the destruction of the Second Temple. For more than 1,000 years, this small community of Ethiopian Jews lived alongside their Christian and Muslim neighbors in the highlands, sometimes at peace, sometimes persecuted, always preserving a religion that the rest of the Jewish world would not even know existed until the modern era. When European Jewish scholars in the late 19th century first encountered the Beta Israel, they were astonished. Here was a community whose Judaism appeared to predate the rabbinic tradition, whose holy book was in a different language, whose customs preserved practices that had vanished from every other Jewish community in the world. In the second half of the 20th century, when the State of Israel was founded, the question of whether the Beta Israel were Jewish enough to qualify for the law of return became a matter of international religious debate. In 1973, the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, Ovadia Yosef, issued a ruling that the Beta Israel were halakhically Jewish, descended, he said, from the lost tribe of Dan. In 1975, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi Shlomo Goren concurred. Beginning in 1977 and continuing through several waves, most famously Operation Moses in 1984 and Operation Solomon in 1991, Israel Air lifted approximately the entire Beta Israel community out of Ethiopia and resettled them in Israel. There are, in 2026, approximately 170,000 Ethiopian Israeli Jews. Most of them, or their parents or grandparents, were born in the highlands of Aksum's old hinterland. Many of them, if asked about their family's deepest origin, will tell you a story about a return from Jerusalem in the 10th century before Christ. The Axumite thread runs into modern is the second thread. The third thread is the Battle of Adwa. On the morning of the 1st of March, 1896, in the highland plain of Adwa, just 30 kilometers from the ancient city of Aksum, an army of approximately 100,000 Ethiopian soldiers, commanded by the Emperor Menelik II, met an Italian invasion force of approximately 20,000 men. Italians had come, as Mussolini would come 40 years later, to add Ethiopia to their colonial empire. They had been building up their position in the lowlands of what is now Eritrea for almost a decade. The Italian government, riding the wave of European colonial confidence at the end of the 19th century, believed that an African army, no matter how large, could not stand against modern European firepower. The Italian government was wrong. In the course of a single morning, the Ethiopian army surrounded and defeated the Italian invasion force. Approximately 7,000 Italian soldiers were killed. Another 4,000 were taken prisoner. The Italian commander, General Oreste Baratieri, fled the field. The Italian government collapsed within weeks. Adwa was the only major military defeat of a European colonial power by an African state in the long century of European colonial expansion in Africa. Continental shock. It became a symbol across the African diaspora and the colonized world of the possibility of resistance. It was also, in a deeper way, an Axumite. The Emperor Menelik II was named after Menelik I, the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. He was, in the Solomonic genealogy that the Kebra Nagas preserves, the direct descendant of the line that had ruled Aksum and its successor kingdoms for nearly 3,000 years. The army he commanded fought in its own self-understanding under the same god that King Ezana had served at Meroe. When the Italians came back to avenge Adwa in 1935 under Mussolini, they came with overwhelming force, with poison gas, with the air power of a modern industrial state. Took Ethiopia for 5. They stole the stela of but they did not ultimately hold the country.
Adwa Castel.
The memory of the Italian humiliation in 1896 was still alive in the Ethiopian imagination. The resistance that began the day the Italians marched into Addis Ababa in 1936 never stopped, and in 1941, with British support, the Ethiopians drove them out again. The thread from the ancient kingdom to the modern state runs in part through the soil of Adwa. This is the third thread. The fourth thread is a man named Tafari Makanan. He was born in 1892 in the small highland town of Ejersagoro, the son of a regional governor and a great-great-great-grandson of a previous Ethiopian emperor. He was Christian Orthodox of the Solomonic line. He was named at his confirmation Ras Tafari Makon. In 1930, after the death of the Empress Sebdetu, Ras Tafari was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia. He took at his coronation a new throne. Chose the name Haile Selassie. It means power of the Trinity. He was the 225th emperor of the Solomonic dynasty, according to the genealogies. Claimed direct descent from Solomon and Makeda. His coronation was attended by representatives from 12 nations and broadcast by radio across the world. Time magazine put him on its cover. The British monarchy sent a delegation. The French sent gifts. The Catholic Church sent a representative. It was the first time in the modern era that the wider world had focused its attention briefly on the Solomonic line that traced back through Aksum to the 10th century before Christ. In 1935, Haile Selassie's empire was invaded by Italy. He fled into exile, where in 1936 he gave one of the most famous speeches of the 20th century before the League of Nations, warning the world that what was being done to Ethiopia would, if not stopped, be done to others. The world did not listen. He returned to his throne in 1941 and reigned for 33 more years, modernizing Ethiopia, founding the Organization of African Unity, becoming one of the most visible African statesmen of the 20th century. In 1974, he was deposed by a Marxist military junta. He died the following year, almost certainly by assassination, smothered in his bed by his own former officers. The Solomonic line, which had ruled by its own counting from approximately the 10th century before Christ, ended in the small bedroom of an old man in 1975. But that is not quite the end of the story. Across the Atlantic, in Jamaica in the late 1920s and early 1930s, a small religious movement had been forming around a particular reading of the Bible. The movement's adherents believed that the Old Testament prophecy of an African king who would lead the redemption of the African diaspora had in their own time come true. Believed the king was Haile Selassie. Called themselves after his pre-coronation name Rastafarians. The Rastafarian movement, which now has between 700,000 and 1 million adherents worldwide, traces its theology, in part, through the Kabra Nagast, which has been translated into English by Rastafarian scholars and is held as a sacred text, back to the Solomonic genealogy that begins in the highlands of Aksum. A Jamaican Rastafarian in 2026, listening to reggae music, growing dreadlocks, abstaining from pork, calling Haile Selassie Jah Rastafari, is, by their own theology, participating in a religion whose roots run through Aksum, through the Queen of Sheba, through Solomon, through a chain of memory 3,000 years long. Axumite thread runs into Trenchtown. This is the fourth thread. The fifth thread is the ceremony itself. We have mentioned the return of the stela of Aksum in 2008. We have not described the day it was raised. It happened on the morning of September 4th. The stela had been transported in pieces in 3 Antonov cargo flights from Rome to Aksum Airport, where it had sat under a canvas shelter for 3 years while the foundation was prepared. The original socket in the bedrock, the one excavated by the Germans in 1906, had been carefully restored. The base of the stela had been recarved where Mussolini's engineers had damaged it during the original theft. Tens of thousands of people came to Aksum for the day, arrived by bus, on foot, in convoys of pickup trucks. Many of them had walked for days from the surrounding highlands. They camped in the fields around the northern stelae field. They prayed through the night. At dawn on the 4th, the Ethiopian Orthodox Patriarch, His Holiness Abuni Paulos, led a procession from the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion to the foot of the stela. He carried a processional. Behind him walked the priests of the surrounding monasteries, hundreds of them in white robes, swinging censers, chanting in Ge'ez. Smoke rose into the cool highland air. The stela was raised by a single large crane, very slowly, over the course of approximately 90 minutes. The crowd watched in absolute, and he wept. Some prostrated themselves on the ground. As the upper third of the stela cleared the horizon, the sun caught the carved false doors at its base, and the granite glowed a soft, warm gold. The stela was vertical when the base had been seated into the bedrock. When the crane was disengaged and lifted away, the patriarch raised his cross and spoke a single short prayer in Ge'ez. The crowd answered. A choir of monks began the traditional anthem of the Tewahedo Church, the slow rolling chant that has been the sound of Aksumite Christianity since the days of Frumentius. Stela had been gone for 71 years. Had been carved 1,600 years before that. It was that morning the oldest object in the modern Ethiopian state that had ever been formally restored to its original location. A woman who had walked 4 days to attend the ceremony was interviewed afterwards by an Ethiopian journalist. She was asked what the moment had meant to her. She thought for a while before answering. My grandmother told me, she said, that her grandmother told her about the day the Italians took the stone. The stone went away. Great-great-grandmother cried. Today my children will tell their children about the day the stone came back. Crying went the other way. The thread in that small story ran through 5 generations and 1 stone. This is the 5th thread. There are, in the highlands of Tigray tonight, in the year 2026, school children who learn to read using the Ge'ez script, the Aksumites modified in the 4th century. There are Ethiopian Orthodox monks chanting the same hymns Frumentius brought from Alexandria. There are Ethiopian Israeli Jews in Tel Aviv whose ancestors, according to their own deepest tradition, walked south from Jerusalem with Menelik I. There are Rastafarians in Kingston who, when they speak of the Lion of Judah, are invoking the heraldic emblem of the Solomonic dynasty that the Aksumites established. The empire that Mani placed beside Rome and Persia and China is, by any standard measure, gone. Political institutions ended. Capital city shrank. Its coinage stopped. Its name dropped for 1,000 years out of the conversation of the wider world. But the threads are still being held. Most of the people holding them do not know whose name to invoke when they ask where the thread began. They know the immediate ancestor, their grandmother, their priest, their rabbi, their Rastafarian elder, but not the origin point, the place where the long line first ran out from a small city on a highland ridge in the 3rd century after Christ. That is what we have done tonight. We have walked back along one of the threads. We have followed it slowly, in the way you follow a thread in a dark room, feeling our way back one loose end at a time until we reach the spool. Spool is in Aksum. Threads run from there. The empire is gone, and the threads are still here, and that is the strangest, gentlest, most quietly persistent kind of survival there is. When you understand that Aksum was placed by the contemporary Persian prophet who knew all Persia and China, that it was, in its own time, considered one of the 4 great kingdoms of the world, it becomes very difficult to look at the standard timeline of ancient history the same way again. The standard timeline of ancient history that you and I grew up with. The Roman emperors, the fall of Rome, the rise of the medieval kingdoms, the Renaissance, is, in some quiet way, a story written by people who lived in places that survived the long centuries with their cultural memory more or less intact, and who, when they began to write their own history, naturally wrote about the cultures that resembled them most. Aksum did not, by the accidents of geography and language and religion, become part of the cultural memory of the people who wrote the standard timeline. It's in this sense not erased. It was more quietly never. The empire was there. Minted its coin. Built its stelae. Became Christian before Rome did. Corresponded with the emperors of Byzantium, sheltered the early followers of Muhammad, traded with India and Sri Lanka. It rose and it faded, and its thread continued through 1,500 years of monastic liturgy and royal succession. When you understand all this, the standard timeline starts to look less like the history of the ancient world, and more like one particular history of one particular set of cultures that happened to be selected by later writers as the standard. There is no standard. There's never a standard. There were many great kingdoms, and Mani knew it, and Aksum was one of them. And the fact that you, listening to this tonight, may be hearing the name for the first time is not a fact about Aksum. It is a fact about which empires we agreed to remember. And it is, possibly, a fact that is in the slow process of changing. And as the candle burns down beside you, somewhere in the highlands of Tigray tonight, the wind is moving across the northern stelae field of Aksum. The great stela, the fallen one, the 520-ton stone that broke in 3 pieces when its builders tried to raise it 1,600 years ago, lies in the soft grass, exactly where it has lain for 16 centuries. The King Ezana stela, 24 meters tall, still stands as it has always stood since the day a 4th century king commanded its raising. The stela of Aksum, the one that was taken to Rome and returned, stands again on the same ground its makers chose for it. A guard is walking between the stones. Stars are out above the plateau. In a small chapel beside the church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, a monk is keeping watch over what may or may not be the Ark of the Covenant. He has not left the courtyard except for funerals of his predecessors since the day he was chosen. In 1,000 churches across Ethiopia and Eritrea and the diaspora, priests are still chanting the morning office in Gas, the same language King Ezana inscribed on his stones. The empire fell 1,600 years ago. Stones remain. Thread very quietly continued. They endured.